Welcome to our lecture on attitude functions and on the functional theory of attitudes. If we remember in our last unit, we described attitudes as our predisposition or our tendency to respond positively or negatively to something, and that something would be an attitude object. So our attitude toward the American flag, toward the New York Yankees, toward the New England Patriots, or the Dallas Cowboys, or the Orlando City soccer team. Any object, it could be a person, a place, an event, or any object like a flag or even a symbol, like a bald eagle, or an issue, whether it's an issue such as Planned Parenthood or an issue such as oil mining and environmental conservation. So our attitudes are our predispositions or our tendencies to respond either positively or negatively to an attitude object. We also said that attitudes are cognitive. We have reasons for our attitudes. They're emotional. We have feelings behind our attitudes. And they're behavioral. They're behavioral because our attitudes influence our behavior. And then our behavior reinforces or can conflict with our attitude. Generally, though, our attitudes influence our behavior in a direct line. If I have positive attitudes toward the Dallas Cowboys, it will influence my behavior in terms of what football games I watch, potentially what NFL merchandise I want to purchase, and it may influence my attitudes toward other teams in the NFL. When we think about attitudes, instead of trying to think of them in this very abstract sense, I think it's beneficial to think of them in terms of the functions that they serve. And attitudes help us to meet our needs. We remember Abraham Maslow designed his pyramid, or his hierarchy of human needs. And he began at the bottom with physiological needs, and then moved up to safety and security and love and belonging, and then further all the way at the top to self-actualization. So people use their attitudes in order to fulfill their needs. And one of their needs is knowledge and understanding. So the first function of attitudes is helping people make sense of the world. Our attitudes and values organize our social world, categorize people, places, and events quickly. So if we think about our different attitudes, we can quickly understand how attitudes, for example, towards September 11 attacks could influence our behavior if we are religious. So if we have positive attitudes toward religion, then after September 11, we may have found comfort in prayer and meditation, and also in believing that the victims of 9/11 are in a better place. So our religious attitudes help us to make sense of our world to a large extent. Maybe our nationalistic attitudes, our pride in the good old USA, help us make sense in the world in terms of determining who are our enemies and who are our friends. So our attitudes and values organize our social world, allow us to categorize people, places, and events quickly. Our attitudes are also utilitarian. They help us to obtain rewards and avoid punishments. And ever since we were children, I'm sure we've heard a parent or some authority figure tell us, "Don't get that attitude with me." Or, "Oh boy, don't look at her, she's got an attitude." And our attitudes influence our behavior. Our attitudes certainly influence our nonverbal behavior, our body language, right? They also influence our perception. So if I have a positive attitude, I may see a brief rainstorm as just a charming little shower. And if I have a negative attitude, that rain cloud could just symbolize my whole life and just be another indication of how dark and dreary the entire world is. So our attitudes shape our perception, but also our behavior. If I have a positive attitude, I behave in a different way than if I have a negative attitude. And if I want to be perceived as a positive person, for instance, by an instructor or by a coach, then I'm going to adopt a positive attitude so that it's obvious in my behavior. So attitudes are functional because they give us knowledge, they help us make sense of the world, they help us obtain rewards and avoid socially adjustive. They allow us to adjust to reference groups. So if we believe that if we adopt a specific attitude, it'll make us more accepted by a group, then we may adopt that attitude. And in that way, the group of the attitude would be socially adjustive. For instance, if a student wants to get along with a musically hip group of friends, he may find it functional to adopt a more favorable attitude toward alternative rock and roll. During the Vietnam War, many young people participated in marches and protests and adopted specific political attitudes, not necessarily because they believed in the cause, but because they believed that by doing so, they would be more accepted by their group. In a way, it's a form of peer pressure, but socially adjustive attitude functions allow us to feel that we're more accepted by a group. Attitudes also help us to form our social identity. They allow us to communicate who we are and what we aspire to be. So that's one reason why people buy certain products. They hope that by displaying the product either in their home or maybe on their body, that they will be advertising and stating what they are and who they aspire to be. Could be anything from perfume to graphic t-shirts, all kinds of brands and labels and logos that we like to display. I have a Ralph Lauren suit, or whatever it might be. But other products serve those purposes as well. I may want to show off my Apple logo and put it on the back window of my car. Have you ever seen an Apple logo on the back window of a car? That's someone who is communicating his or her social identity. And those attitudes, that positive attitude toward Apple, allows that person to communicate who they are and what they aspire to be. Attitudes are also value expressive. People hold attitudes to express their core values and cherished beliefs. For instance, my belief in the value of the environment would influence my attitudes toward recycling or eco-friendly behaviors, or my attitudes toward the size of the carbon footprint I want to leave. And that's just one example. Attitudes are also ego defensive. So the attitude might be a defense mechanism that an individual uses against unpleasant emotions that they do not want to consciously acknowledge. So some people adopt attitudes to shield themselves from uncomfortable truths. For instance, a young woman decides to break up with her boyfriend, and she adopts a very hostile attitude, even though she may still have feelings for the young man, because it strengthens her resolve and allows her to muster the strength to end the relationship. A central principle of the functional theory is that the same attitudes can serve different functions for different people. In other words, people can hold the same attitude toward a person, a product, or an issue, but they may hold this view in order to buy products they need. They go to the mall to purchase presents for loved ones and go home once the presents are paid for. Others shop for ego-defensive reasons to help them forget about their problems or to relieve stress, as we heard it called retail therapy before, right? And to these folks, especially for recent immigrants to America who sometimes shop to satisfy their value-expressive needs, our country symbolizes the freedom to do as they wish. For those who grew up in maybe poor countries, the notion that you can shop till you drop is one of the great appeals of the United States. For American teenagers, shopping may fill entirely different needs. And going to the mall is more of a be seen and a social expressive purpose. Functional theory suggests that a persuasive message is likely to change an individual's attitude when the message is directed at the underlying function the attitude serves. So whether the function serves to help the person express who he or she may be, whether the function serves to allow them to make better sense out of the world, or to earn some rewards or avoid some punishments, or to be more accepted by a group. When the message is directed at that underlying function, it's going to be more persuasive and it's going to be more perfected or more effective. So messages that match the function served by an attitude should be more compelling than those that are not relevant to the attitude's function. Does that make sense? About 89 million people volunteer their time in the United States every year in order to help sick, needy, homeless, and psychologically troubled people. They work in soup kitchens on weekends or participate in walkathons, offer counseling to distressed groups, and many different issues. A functional theorist, moved by people's willingness to help others in need, asks, why did these people give so generously of themselves? And what they found out was that there are many different reasons. Some people are just kind of selfless and they have a humanitarian concern for others. Some are curious about the world and learning more about people who are very different from themselves. Some are coping with inner conflicts and they may want to reduce the guilt they feel about being so much more fortunate than other people. Some may say that by volunteering, it provides them with opportunities to participate in activities that are valued by others. So when extremely rich people volunteer, especially maybe the ones that are in organizations designed to help the less fortunate, then it allows them to brag about, all that they do to help other people and maybe to feel like they are more accepted by the group since the group values service to others. Also, people volunteer because it may have career-related benefits, such as somebody who is applying to college and can demonstrate in their application that they have volunteer experience and maybe that they've learned new skills or have developed professional contacts. So, functional theory tells us that a persuasive message is most likely to change an individual's attitude when the message is directed at the underlying function the attitude serves. So, if you want to recruit volunteers or persuade people to continue volunteering, you have to understand why they chose to volunteer in the first place. And one message will not fit all of those different categories of reasons for why people volunteer. So it's important to make sure that the message matches the need. Unfortunately, attitudes can also serve dysfunctional purposes when they do not help us meet our needs or when they cause other negative effects, such as a young teenager who wants to express his autonomy and maybe his disregard for his parents or the norms of society by getting his tongue pierced, and then it gets infected and he suffers terrible consequences. So that might be considered a dysfunctional attitude function. And your book gives several other examples, but sometimes our attitudes stand in the way of our ability to meet our needs or to achieve success or to complete a project or a task or to treat other people respectfully. And when our attitudes do not allow us to meet our needs more efficiently, when they cause us to behave in ways that may be harmful to others or ourselves, then we label them as dysfunctional. According to the functional theory of attitudes, we need to understand attitudes based on the function they serve in allowing people to meet their needs. Some of the issues with this functional theory include the fact that some people may not know why they hold an attitude, or they may not want to admit the truth about why they hold an attitude. And then it's sometimes difficult to determine if an attitude helped or harmed a person's efforts to meet his or her needs. And that's very true, especially in the context when people adopt an attitudes as a defensive mechanism to cope with their inability to face the truth about something. When do you think an attitude may not predict someone's behavior? I think we behave in ways that go against our attitudes, sometimes due to social pressures, but there are other pressures as well that we'll discuss in the next unit, in the next video. Overall, we can draw some very specific nuggets of information from the functional theory of attitudes. First, people are deep and complicated creatures. Our actions are sometimes difficult to explain unless we can understand the attitude that's guiding that behavior or that action. For instance, some people in the older generation may not understand why younger people want to get tattoos or body piercings, and maybe that's because they haven't analyzed the person's motivation or the attitudes underlying that behavior, such as their need to be accepted by the group so that they're value adjustive, or to express themselves, or to defend themselves against feelings maybe of not being accepted by other people. Secondly, we need to make sure that we extend tolerance to other people based on the previous reason. People have many reasons for holding an attitude, and we need to be tolerant because we may not always understand why somebody behaves in a specific way or why somebody adopts a specific attitude. So by being tolerant and maybe engaging with the person, we may develop a more robust and holistic understanding of the person's motivations and behaviors. Finally, persuaders must be acutely sensitive to the functions that attitudes serve, because a message can change attitudes only if it connects with people.